My name is Nicole Jacobs, and I'm the chief executive of an organization called Standing Together Against Domestic Violence. So you're in the domestic abuse and safeguarding session. Hope you're in the right place. And what I'm going to aim to do is tell you a little bit about what we do at Standing Together, but more importantly talk about lessons that we've learned in relation to domestic homicide reviews, and talk a bit about and hear a bit from you about your work in relation to domestic abuse. So then by way of introduction, Standing Together is an organization that sits in West London. So we're in the Tri-Borough, Hammersmith and Fulham, Kensington and Chelsea and Westminster. And that's where we operationally do all of our work. So what brings me to Lewisham is that in Lewisham, Standing Together has chaired some of your domestic homicide reviews. And I'm fairly familiar with not all, but some of the work in Lewisham that takes place. So that's why I was really keen to come today to be part of this conference, because there are some lessons that we're learning in adult safeguarding in relation to domestic homicide reviews that I'd like to tell you about and maybe hear your thoughts about as well. So Standing Together as an organization was set up about 20 years ago to coordinate the community response to domestic abuse in our area in West London. So our founders were the head of the police, the CPS, the law center, the local authority, very importantly the Women's Refuge locally at the time, all basically got together and said, number one, we don't do very well related to domestic abuse at all. Hopefully the Refuge didn't say that, but the others were saying that. And we certainly don't work well together. So we could have an effort where we all want to improve, and we would probably go back to our own individual organizations and improve a little bit, but not much. And so they created Standing Together as a charity that sits outside of the local authority to do just that. So that's what Standing Together is all about. Mostly, in almost any other area, including Lewisham, that type of charity doesn't exist. The function of coordination in relation to domestic abuse likely sits in your community safety unit or community safety team at the local authority, and that's the case in most areas. But in any case, what Standing Together aims to do is essentially kind of have a bit of a framework and a managed process in any service, in any aspect of the community that helps, number one, allow for services to feel more confident to do better in relation to domestic abuse, and number two, helps support the idea of working together. So that's by training, that's by collecting data, that's by operational groups that meet quarterly. We do all sorts of things in the Tri-Borough and West London to make that happen. And essentially, this is a little bit of kind of the breadth of services that we've built up over the years. So the first thing we had to do when we started was create referral pathways, because in West London 20 years ago, there were not what you would call IDVA services or your specialist domestic abuse services. They didn't exist. There was a bit of refuge provision, a little bit of outreach, and nothing much else. So if we wanted our criminal justice partners to do better, they had no support, they had no referral pathway. So the first thing we had to do was establish that. And we created specialist courts in our areas where we cluster all of our domestic abuse cases into one court in Hammersmith and Westminster, and we bring all of our services together to concentrate our efforts on those days. We have court management groups, we co-locate with the police in terms of helping improve the criminal justice response. We do a breadth of work in health services. So very quickly after we started, after a couple of years, we realized there were lots of people who would never come close to the criminal justice system who would be seeking support in various health settings. So we do work within our mental health trusts. acute hospital trust, community, and children's services. We coordinate our MARAC. Does everybody know MARAC, that term? So the Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conferences. We coordinate those in our area. We do work in the community. We do a lot of work with housing, and we do community-based work. So that gives you a sense of the breadth of what we do in relation to domestic abuse as Standing Together. And then we have a sister charity or set of charities that do all of the front line work, meaning one-to-one work with victim survivors. So our work is much more institutional change and supporting that coordinated response. And this gives you a sense, I think, of some of the challenges in relation to domestic abuse, because people don't fall neatly into one category, do they? Very often survivors of domestic abuse don't call it domestic abuse. And they certainly don't kind of very neatly go to just one service and then from then on to other services. So the real breadth of work needed is to ensure that most areas of work in the community have some level of knowledge and support to intervene early, so that we have the best chance at addressing domestic violence as quickly as we can. For example, housing. Is anyone here from housing? I had my last group, I had a couple of which part, where are you in housing?
So we work for a housing association.
Okay, which one?
L&Q.
Okay, L&Q, huge. Yeah, and? Hyde, okay, fantastic. So in housing, we have worked operationally in the Triborough for quite a few years, and we've formed with Gen 2 and Peabody, who you all will recognize, I think, the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, which is about standards within housing. And when we've looked at our partner, Gen 2, which is up in Northumberland, they reach people, they reach their own tenants who are suffering domestic abuse about a year before the national data set for people who are going to specialist services. So that just gives you a sense of how much earlier you can intervene and impact on people's lives if you really do work within these various settings. So that's what Standing Together is all about, and it gives and part of the reason why we got into domestic homicide reviews and the reason why we were approached to do them by places like Lewisham is kind of the breadth of work that we do in lots of different areas. So that's partly what brings me here today. Before I go on, could I ask you, how many of you are working within adult social care in Lewisham? Okay, so quite a lot of you. And then we've got a couple of people working within housing. How many of you are working within a charity service, type service? Which one?
Family Action.
Family Action, okay, great. And Citizens Advice, amazing, that's great. And how many of you are in a health-related setting? Few? Okay. And if I'm not said, how many of you haven't been able to raise your hand because I haven't picked the right? Yeah.
I'm on a council sort of rogue landlord team, prosecute rogue landlords.
Oh. Interesting. Okay, so we've got something that's Standing Together. We've got a post that's dealing with private rented sector, which is and domestic abuse. So it'd be great to give you my card after this. Yeah. So that's good for me just to have a sense before I get started who's from where. So that's Standing Together, and that's kind of the work that we do. And when domestic homicide reviews became a statutory requirement in 2011, what that meant was anytime there was a murder that happened in a local area that met that definition, so and that definition is about whether the victim and the perpetrator were either had been currently or formerly intimate partners or family members, then it would fall under this definition of requiring a domestic homicide review. How many of you have sat on a panel related to a domestic homicide? Okay, you have. Where are you from again? Oh, excellent, okay. So that became a statutory requirement. So when there is a murder that that has happened in Lewisham, which there's been quite a few actually, then the community safety partnership has to conduct a review and think about and consider what lessons there are to be learned. Similar to serious case reviews, and we've chaired, I think, 5 in Lewisham at Standing Together alone. You've had other chairs as well, and we've chaired, sadly, now over 60 just at Standing Together in doing our chairing of homicide reviews. And the reason why we're interested in that is, if you think about our mission as a charity, is about promoting the coordinated response to domestic abuse, and also learning as much as we can about what should be happening best and practice that needs improvement. These are instances where there's a lot to learn very often. And so what happened was, we got to about our 30th review and thought there were very similar patterns of things happening in all of these reviews. And so we thought we really want to distill some of our own learning and disseminate some learning about what are the most common themes within domestic homicide reviews. All domestic homicide reviews they're done at the local level. They're chaired by an independent chair, but all of the panel members will be local professionals. The family will input into those reviews if you're lucky, because then they can give some really valuable insight as well. And then when they're finished, they go off to the Home Office for a quality assurance. And so there's been a lot of pressure put on the Home Office to do more of this kind of dissemination of learning from these reviews. And they've published a couple of relatively short papers. And the thinking has been that, we have a government now that is very much about localism. And so there hasn't been a big distillation of or analysis of these homicide reviews yet. Nationally, because obviously we don't chair them all. We've chaired the ones I can tell you about. But the view of the government at this stage is these are largely local learning. This is local learning, local practice. And so what we thought we would do is partner with the Child and Women Abuse Studies Unit at London Metropolitan University, and we did our own kind of section of findings because we could see, as chairing so many, that there were really similar themes throughout. So that's what I'm going to tell you a little bit about today and hear your thoughts about. You can see from this, of the first 32 that we did, about 3 out of 4 were intimate partner homicides. So people where one person murdered either their current or their former partner. And a fourth of the cases, they were family-related homicide, adult-child to family member. So typically mom, sometimes their father, in one case in this situation a twin brother, but adult children. And you can see the gender breakdown was fairly asymmetrical in that most of the victims are women and most of the perpetrators were men. And that's not to say there weren't some important anomalies there. For example, there was a review that we did that related to a same-sex couple where there's some really important findings. But in general, it's a fairly gendered approach, as would be most of your domestic abuse caseload in general. But that doesn't mean that men are not victims of domestic abuse. I'm not saying that at all. Where would you expect to see men most likely? Which service or set of services might you see male victims the most? Would just be your guess. Somebody? Health. Yeah, so in health services, we found in the Triborough and most areas that have kind of a lot of active engagement within health settings, we'll find that that's where they'll pick up most of their male victims of domestic abuse, because they would be more kind of friendly in terms of, or more obvious places that someone may think to go to for help in those situations. Let's just talk through a little bit about the victim demographics. So we have a fairly gendered demographic. We have 19% of people with disabilities, which is obviously relevant to you all in adult safeguarding. Most myths out there are myths about domestic abuse taking place primarily in one group over another. In other words, there's a lot of myths about domestic abuse happens mainly in, with people from particular ethnic minority backgrounds, which we know is not true. We know all research in all countries, including the UK, don't bear that out. We often hear that domestic abuse happens more with poor people rather than people who have more means. And we know, again, that's not true. And that doesn't bear out in anything that we know in practice and research. What we do know is that people will access services differently. So if I'm fairly well off and I can afford a lawyer, I might get a divorce and move in with my sister for a while or something like that, rather than go to a refuge. So it's not that it doesn't happen, but it means that the way people might pursue safety or planning to get away from that situation, people will do things differently. But disability is one place where you can see a definite pattern where there's an increase in victimization. So women who are disabled in particular will experience domestic abuse. They'll be twice as likely than the rest of the population. So why do you think that might be? Well, just a guess, or you may know.
They're
What?
more vulnerable. They're more vulnerable and less able to
Yeah.
take action.
Yeah. Okay. So more vulnerable, less able to take action.
What if they just have small dependence because of their disability?
Yeah. So more dependent, right?
More likely to report.
Maybe. Yeah, because they'll be in situations where they'll be able to talk to people. It's a really good point.
Does it include learning disability in that group? Because obviously the issues around passivity and all sorts of different things come in relation to the learning disabilities, I think.
So if we know the root of domestic abuse is about wanting, especially in the intimate partner homicide, in that side of those domestic abuse cases, if we know that that's a lot about power and control, and you can do things that will make that worse, obviously. So if someone wants power and control over their partner, or current or former partner, and you drink alcohol, or you have other financial problems, or you can name any number of things, that can certainly make the situation worse, can't it? But I often think of it as like fuel on a fire. The root of it is still there, and it's the need and the desire to have control over the other. And things can pile on top and make the situation much worse. So, but if the root of it is power and control, then I think it does, some of what you've said does bear out in terms of somebody who wants to be quite controlling will likely gravitate to people who they can see that's easier to do that with. So you can see again in the domestic homicide reviews a bit of that too. Age, a lot of people are very surprised by this. The mean age was 41, and you've got 10 cases where the age was 60 to 81, and 7 cases 40 to 59. I think most people think of the domestic homicides as being younger people and younger couples, but it's not the case. There's some obviously quite a few that are, but there's quite a few that aren't. How many domestic homicides do you think there are in England every week?
15.
Well, thank goodness, not quite that high. 1 to 2 every week. So over the course of a year, a little over 100. And that's been fairly steady for quite a number of years. The Met Police has shown bits of dips, but nothing consistent enough to call it a pattern. So it's a fairly consistent statistic, unfortunately. If we were to just concentrate on those older age bracket, How does that make sense to you that there would be so many people who are a little bit older?
Dementia.
So there you see a bit of dementia in some of the much older age brackets, yeah. What about somebody who's suffering domestic abuse and their thoughts about seeking help or talking to someone about it?
I think for me, especially with the part that's talking about the ethnicity part of it, it's about some people believe they need to be in that situation because they're married and all that kind of stuff. So rather than talk about it, it's something from a cultural point of view, people don't normally talk about. Because it's not, you don't wash your dirty linen in public and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's about that awareness, about people understanding, this is not acceptable, rather than it being acceptable. And I think that's where a lot of people are in a dilemma, if I talk about this, what's going to happen to me?
Yeah.
And especially if you're putting the issue around immigration into the equation, you've got a dichotomy of quite a lot of difficult dilemmas for people across the board. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen even to an older population, but it's something that's quite prevalent especially within the environment I work, which is in hospital.
Yeah.
When you get those kind of cases, it's more about something they intended that they may lose rather than against something they may gain.
Yes. Yeah. There's a lot of consequence to changing, disrupting your life. In order to be separated or away from that person who's violent or who's abusive. So those are all really good points, and they're things that we have to take on board. And when we're thinking about, I love the speakers this morning who were talking about just opening the conversations and building a trusted relationship, a trusted conversation. These are all the things we're for domestic abuse in particular, these are all the things that we're really carefully thinking about when we're going about that are going to make a huge difference. So understanding it from the world from that person's point of view is really important. So older people, we'll go back to some of that ethnic break, kind of the discussion about that in just a minute. But older people might have been in the relationship for quite a long time. So invested, may think, well, why would, maybe we'll make assumptions about what's happening there or not based on how long they've been together. So you might say to yourself, well, this couple's been together for 20 years, 25 years. It couldn't be so bad. Or something would have been done before. Remember what I said about how long standing together's been around? We've only been around for 20 years. Refuges were, when I arrived from the US 20 years ago, in my area at least, in West London, there were basically refuges and a little bit else, not much else. And refuges had only been around, for 20 years beyond that. So in other words, there's a lot of people who are older right now who, whenever they might have thought to seek help years ago, there wasn't any help, or it was so thin on the ground, and there were the attitudes of the police and other services have changed a lot. We've learned a lot. Society has changed a lot. So the perception and the help seeking has changed a lot over time, which I think is worth thinking about. What else about older people would you think might be a barrier?
I think for older people that have been 40, 45 years married, they financially invested a lot.
Yeah.
When they get to the late 60s, early 70s, it's the thought of divorcing, dividing the home up. Where do I go? I've not got that disposable income independently anymore now, so I'm going to be poorer. And they find that even more difficult. Where would they fit comfortably in a refuge anyway?
Yes.
It's more geared to get up young people. It's more difficult for them to give up even though they're in a difficult situation.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of truth in all of that. I think those are really good points. And I think one of the speakers earlier today talked about the new legislation related to coercion and control. And I was really delighted when I saw that highlighted because, we have a new criminal offense that's related to those patterns of behavior. And I'm not necessarily delighted about that in and of itself, but it just raises our awareness of the breadth of behaviors that we're talking about. So we're talking about physical abuse, but what else would we be talking about? Mental, yeah, psychological or emotional abuse. What else? Sexual abuse, financial abuse. Yeah, well, it's kind of in the breadth of violence against women and girls, yeah, or those strategies, yeah. Intimidation, threats, all of these things. And so if I were older, just hanging with that for just a minute, some of the way that domestic abuse works is the fact that the physical or sexual violence ever existed in the first place. So, for example, if my partner hit me in a discussion, in an argument about a decision we were trying to make, I would remember that, wouldn't I? So what's going to happen the next time it's time for a similar type of decision? What might my thought process be?
Agree with that
I
person.
think I'd be more likely to agree, wouldn't I? Even if my partner said to me, I'm so sorry, I'll never do that again. All of those, the context is different now. And so that's where coercion and control is really, really important in having these conversations, because someone who's older, or actually anyone, might be thinking, well, I can't talk about all these other things that are just, these other parts of being coerced or controlled, because they won't necessarily use those words. But they will be thinking, oh, is the physical abuse that I've experienced lately bad enough to bother you about it? And this is what victims say a lot. When you say, why did you call the police? No, why not? Because I wasn't sure it was bad enough. Like that one the one incident and that's an isolated incident. It's not taking into account this breadth and pattern of coercion and control. So I could be in a relationship where I'm controlled essentially from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to sleep, in that I can't see who I want to see. I can't spend money, even if it's my money. I can't do a lot of what I want to do, but I could still spend that entire day and not have any physical abuse. It's just the consequence of knowing if I step out of the boundaries, right? And so that's what a lot of what domestic abuse is about. And some of where we go wrong is we talk and focus on the physical violence. And I did that when I was a new worker years ago now. I was very interested to know sometimes it is quite good to know what the worst physical incident would be. But sometimes it's not, because it's a misnomer. You could be talking to someone who's very, very controlled, and that last physical incident could have been months ago. But the patterns of coercion and control are still there. And I think these are really good things to highlight when you're thinking about conversations with older people. So there's a lot to say and a lot to unpick about that demographic and the fact that these are a lot older people. The other thing to unpick about that is that quite a few of those older victims are parents of a 30-something-year-old. Not young, I think sometimes we hear, and there is one case in this cohort of people where it was quite a young man who had a psychotic episode. But in general, if I had to describe the children I'm talking about men in their 30s who have lived away from home and for whatever reason have moved back into their parents' house, who have who aren't doing well in life in general, but not so unwell in life that they tend to be interacting with services a lot. So they might have a little bit of interaction, say, with mental health services. They might have some minor kind of lower level kind of incidents with the police related to other things. They might be using drugs or substances and engaging a bit with substance misuse services, but they're not people who are kind of jumping out off of our risk assessments as, you know, really troubling people. But they're just not doing that well. And they kind of will stay in the family home for a period of time. And that's more the profile of the people who, and I'm not saying everybody who meets that category is going to kill their mother or their dad, but I guess it does beg the question, you know, what do we think in those circumstances? And in these cases, most of the thought process was, that's great that mom or dad is looking after that person. I mean, that's kind of usually what the families thought. That's usually what a lot of services thought. And it is fairly isolating because it's clear there's nowhere else for that child to go, even though they're not really a child anymore, but it's child to the parent. So that's the other kind of situation. And of course, our domestic abuse services are never going to be reaching out to that cohort of people, because that's not what they're set up to do. It's not what we talk about when we talk about domestic abuse. So I think we do have to recognize that's a significant minority of this cohort, a fourth, and we have to be thinking about, well, whether it's through GP services or other more generalized services where parents can go when they have some concerns related to their adult children. Ethnicity, back to you and some of your points. So we've got issues related to immigration. You've got issues related to perception of kind of this is what happens in my family. What are some other reasons why this is an overrepresentation of BME people getting murdered? So why would we think that's going to be an overrepresentation as compared to the population? What are your thoughts about how that could happen? Shame. So, yeah. So, are our services reaching out as much as they can in communities? And are communities are various communities feeling comfortable to access services? Okay.
Lack of awareness of services.
And lack of awareness. Okay. Lack of awareness of services. That's totally across the board, by the way. If you could do one thing starting tomorrow, I would ask you to tell people about services. We think in general people know about services. I guarantee you, we could go out in front of this building right now and ask people, what are your domestic abuse services in Lewisham? And I would be shocked if anybody would be able to tell you. And so that's one thing we can do a lot of. Go ahead.
I think that is compounded with language.
Language,
So
yep.
That lack of awareness. You can't read English, understand English. Then it's going to be difficult for you to.
That's right.
Read the information that is out there.
Yeah, and if you're fairly new to the country, you will have views about what a social worker does, what a police officer does, that will be different than maybe what would happen here. Because you'll be bringing your experience rightfully from other places that may or may not be the same as here. So you have cases in this cohort where people are very afraid of services. And of course, if the only people who are telling you about those services are maybe the perpetrator's family and the perpetrator, you're really stuck because you don't know who to trust. So there are those kinds of cases too. So just understanding the perception in general of what the state can do is really, really prevalent in these cases. The fear of having children taken away is very, very dominant in these types of cases. Yep. Somebody wanted to say something, I thought. No, you, oh, sorry.
Yeah, can I ask, what does the diagram mean?
Adult family homicide.
Right.
Is the 5 of 8. So you can see the majority of the adult family homicides, the cases where the adult child has killed a parent. There's an overrepresentation in terms of BME. This is again a small number, but it's worth talking about.
Where the adult
and then IPH is
killed.
Intimate partner.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's just a way to remind us that if you're wondering, it's a fairly similar dynamic in both cohorts of those people.
Will it also be more difficult for people to access services if there's not specific cultural services out there that recognise particular cultural needs of
Yeah, that's true. And that can kind of work both ways. You've got people who actually would rather access a generic service because they're going to think, well, nobody there's going to know anybody in my family or wider network. And then you have people who would much prefer to access something that's culturally more aligned to what they're used to. But that's why we do need our charity sector and our third sector to be really diverse and strong, because in our area, for example, we have both, so that people could choose where they're going to access services. But we're in the age of austerity. It's really hard for all areas to have that. Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask, where does the issue around honor killing come into this? Does it come in this bracket? Because it's quite prevalent, especially within some cultures. I'm not saying everyone, but it does happen. And and the link between that, religious beliefs, religion, and that sort of mix.
Yeah.
How does that?
Well, in this grouping, this is only 32 cases. It's all
Yes.
tragic. There aren't any so-called honor-related killings. But I do understand your point, which is, we have to remind ourselves within any religion, there's more very conservative elements and more liberal elements. And so some of what you see in a couple of these cases are situations where somebody's gone and got their religious leader involved, who's really reinforced the idea that things should stay very private and stay within the family, and that is not it's turned out very tragically. But there is a link, obviously, in that idea of kind of bringing shame on the family. And I think in general, the last group and I were talking about this too, some of the things that we say would be kind of quote unquote culturally specific would actually be a fairly similar dynamic in a lot of people. People in general will feel shame. They'll not want to embarrass their family. They'll not want their privacy to be known to other people. So some of what we tiptoe around in terms of culture in general is very true of many victims of domestic abuse. And so some of what's happened in these cases are services kind of shying away, partly because they don't want to step on they don't want to, be culturally insensitive, when actually they should have been. They should have been much more proactive. But they thought, this is, I'm being told this is what's happening in this family, and I shouldn't, maybe I'll just leave that alone then. And I think with domestic abuse, we always have to realize there's, the breadth of what potentially could be going on and the breadth of what is being hidden to us. Yeah.
One thing that struck me, and I don't know the tolerance levels for people that are perhaps older and also based on their ethnic background might be that traditionally what used to happen was some of the abuse was accepted, if it was up just your verbal abuse, and then when it goes on to physical abuse, even that was accepted. So when you come to the age of 41, you're starting to become only then aware that you've been suffering from this. And even when you are coming from an ethnic background, you think it's acceptable. You've grown up with that sort of environment. So all of a sudden, for you to say it's not acceptable, people aren't aware, and people don't recognize it until perhaps when it's too late, or where they can't do anything, or they feel they can't do anything.
Yeah, and this is the really challenging thing for you as individual professionals, is that what you're being encouraged to do is carefully kind of have those conversations. And you're having conversations with people who may not be naming what they're going through as domestic abuse, probably not, in fact, most times. What would be the more likely things that you would hear people say instead of using domestic abuse? What would they be like? What would you be more likely to hear?
Someone's aggressive,
Yeah.
loud, firm.
Yeah, so you'd hear things that are describing. Yeah.
not getting along.
Not getting along, exactly. Difficult, somebody's difficult. These are all the kinds of things you're going to be more likely to hear. I can tell you, in 20 years that I've worked, every time I've sat in a group with survivors of domestic abuse and we've talked about the term domestic abuse, every single time, and if not everybody in the group said, oh, I never would have called it that. I didn't realize that until later. I call it that now, but I didn't call it that at the time. And that's exactly why I walked right by the domestic abuse poster. And that's why I never picked up the leaflet, because I didn't think it was me. I didn't think that was me. So this is a huge obstacle we have in all of your day-to-day work. And so it's a lot about feeling confident to maybe enter into those conversations by saying, that sounds to me like that could be what I would call domestic abuse. Can we, is that possible? Can we talk about that? And it might be that you then have to describe the range of behaviors beyond physical violence what you're talking about. And then usually if you get to a point in that type of conversation, people will say, I get threatened about that. Yeah, I get, I'm threatened about what will be done if I were to do this. Sometimes it's good to just put it the other way around and say to someone, what would happen if you went out today and took out £100 out of the account and spent it on whatever you wanted? What would happen? It's like, in other words, just any kind of scenario that gets a sense of how much someone has their own, ability to take their own actions day to day. What would happen if you wanted to go out with your friends tonight and you wanted to make arrangements to do that? Those kinds of things. So it's about the kind of conversations that you have.
What is the 5/8 for the AFH?
That just means out of the 8 people who were murdered, 5 of them were from BME backgrounds. So it's just about opening the conversation. Some of this is just heightening our awareness of some of the barriers. That's essentially what these are. Barriers for possibly people seeking help or being able to get the help they need. So it's just a way to flesh that out in conversation with you. So these are the key themes that came out from the analysis that we did. And you can get the whole analysis on our website if you would like. There is an executive summary, and you can it gives you a shorter version. But if you were ever doing trainings or you wanted your team to see it, feel free to download it. Number 1 is about risk. So in domestic abuse, we use something called the COTA risk assessment, or a risk indicator checklist, RIC. You could just Google it. If you've never seen it, it would be really well worth having a look at, because it'll tell you all of the main risk factors that correlate to homicide or serious harm. And there are things like previous convictions, recent separation, use of weapons, conflict over child contact arrangements, things that would be fairly obvious to you, but it's a really good tool where you could see them all at once and you could get a sense of, okay, these are the kinds of things I could be asking about to see what's going on here.
What is it called again?
It's called the CADA CAADA DASH, and then if you just do capitals RIC, risk indicator checklist. And I guarantee you it'll be the first thing that'll come up if you Google. You'll be able to get a copy of it. In these cases, we know retrospectively what the risk was, and I'll tell you that in a minute. But the big learning point from these cases is that people did not recognize the domestic abuse. So, these conversations we were just talking about, how critical they are. In these cases, these are the people who were murdered were seeing services a lot. They saw the GP, for example, more than the average person does. They saw lots of services, housing, social workers, it could go on and on. But in those interactions, no one picked up, or hardly ever picked up, the idea that this was someone suffering domestic abuse. And that's why these conversations are so critical. And they are people who are showing pretty good sign of domestic abuse,
So
but they just weren't. just dismissed, maybe thought, well, I'm going to underestimate what's happening here. I'm not going to ask about it. Lack of training for some of people who haven't had the benefit of having training and having discussions about it. So it is the dominant theme is the need for that coordinated response, which is where we're having these kinds of conversations. And the domestic abuse can be picked up.
Can I ask what the examples of the signs they were showing that the professionals didn't pick up? Because that's quite insightful.
Yeah, so they would, some of the things you've said about what is said, I'm being harassed,
Okay,
could
so
be
it was
some
quite bold.
sign of injury.
So it was. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. They weren't like really subtle signs often.
Yeah.
They'd be
Okay, so
sometimes,
they were really.
yeah, sometimes where there's clear, disclosure from a child at school, friends or neighbors calling the police. So there are
Quite
where
bold.
you can kind of detect some worries. But when we got to the point where you could actually do a risk assessment, it wasn't done, or have a conversation to know more about what the situation was, it wasn't done. Health, it was is a huge area where both the victim and the perpetrator will have 100% of the time seen the GP regularly. And in half of those cases, there were missed opportunities where either the perpetrator or the victim definitely spoke about or had injuries, talked about relationship breakdown, talked about anxiety, depression, worries, and none of the domestic abuse was asked about, or there wasn't anything proactive. So lots to learn in those settings where we know we're going to intervene early. Safeguarding children, just for ease of time, those are lessons that mainly we've learned already in serious case reviews, but again, just haven't been implemented as well. So fear of children's services by victims, fear of having the children taken away, all of those things. A lot of invisibility of the perpetrator within children's services. So lots of pressure being put on the victim, not a lot of pressure being put on the non-abusing or the abusive parent, because the abusive parent is actually nowhere to be found and isn't coming to the meeting. So a lot of the pressure being put on the person who does. So that's a lot of the general learning in safeguarding children. Safeguarding adults is where we've got some of the issues we've been talking about. People in older age groups who've not had, who are maybe disabled or in caring relationships, but no caring assessment's ever been done. And in general, again, these are the worst case scenarios. This is not what I'm thinking you're doing every day, by the way. These are the things we're learning from, which is, a perception that this situation seems pretty good. It's not reaching, quote unquote, any thresholds. They seem to be looking after each other okay. So therefore, this isn't kind of an adult safeguarding issue. That's the general scope of what you would see. And again, the same with the adult child living at home. This is an adult child, is not doing that well, doesn't kind of quote unquote meet any thresholds, so therefore everything seems okay. They seem to be doing all right, and they have kind of capacity. So, this is the conundrum, I think, of what do we do and how do we address that. Informal networks. People who are experiencing domestic abuse are just like the rest of us. Who would we tell our problems to? It won't be first to a service usually. It's going to be to your friends, your family, or selected friends and family. And very often these informal networks aren't trying to do harm, but very often they will advise things that are harmful though. Staying together, keeping things quiet, keeping things within the family, not, reinforcing maybe a thought that we shouldn't trust the social worker or the teacher at school because this is going to get out of control and out of hand. So there's a lot we can do as a community in general in these kind of, to raise more awareness in the friends, family, social networks. The most common risk factors you can see in these are abuse to previous partners, wider offending history. This is particularly true of the adult child living at home who's murdered a parent. Some minor offending related to neighbors, former co-workers, possibly former partners. With the intimate partner homicides, a lot of coercive control, obviously jealous surveillance, what we might call stalking, but very often people misinterpret the 20 texts they get every day and the fact they have to keep up, and maybe they get followed around and met outside of work, don't necessarily kind of think of that as stalking behavior, which is essentially it is. And separation. So we've got separation in red, because that is the most kind of, that should be the risk factor we're thinking about primarily almost always, right? Because most of the homicides happen within the first few months after separation. So when we ask people, why don't you just leave? The fact is, leaving is actually escalating the risk. And why would that be? Why would it make sense to us that that would be a point where the perpetrator would be more likely to severely harm or murder someone?
Because he's lost that control that he had. He's extra angry, and they're probably in an environment where they're not able to be as vigilant, and there's no one there to protect them either. So they're in a strange place they've run to, and he's extra angry. He just loses it.
Absolutely. So separation is something that, it's not that we don't want to, you wouldn't want to say, oh, don't separate. I mean, people will have to carefully think about what they can do or not do in their own situation. But it is something where we have to remember that if someone's going to do that, they have to do it safely. And they have to have good advice doing it. And that's where you come in. It's where your specialist services for domestic abuse come in to play really heavily. Suicide attempts of the perpetrator. Why we care about the perpetrator, obviously we don't want anyone to commit suicide. Why is that worrying for the victim? She might blame herself.
It's more about guilt, really.
Guilt, yeah.
Could be children involved. Could be children involved.
Yeah, so it could be used, and children could be involved. And critically, they could kill a child or kill the victim as well, in that state of mind. And that's what happens. We see that in the papers, don't we? People who, in custody situations, they have custody of the child and kill the child, kill themselves. Or they kill in some of these cases, killed the partner or ex-partner, killed themselves. So again, in mental health settings when we hear that. And then of course, very relevant to you is the issues we've talked about related to older women or older people with disabilities and caring relationships that aren't kind of classified officially as carers, but where there's clearly a caring dynamic. I know I have to leave you, but I just wanted to kind of to say a lot about some of the discussions we've had really bring me a lot of hope about this, because you're really engaged, you're really thinking about, and obviously know quite a lot about this topic already. And it is about, the key learning about all of these situations is about, having the conversation and thinking about what can I do to try to open this conversation up, and also maybe do whatever I can to bridge this person into other services. So whether it's something that you can do in that moment. When we meet, I'll ask someone from the specialist service or the IDVA service to come, or you're considering referring someone into the MARAC, or any of those kinds of steps. But the more you can do to broaden and kind of inch forward, sometimes it's not the greatest step forward. It is the smaller steps that we take that for victims of domestic abuse will make the largest difference in the end. The fact that they know that you care, the fact that they know you would call it domestic abuse. because then they'll start then the next time they go by the poster, they're thinking about the poster, or they see the leaflet and they pick it up because they're remembering you called it domestic abuse. You know, the idea of maybe talking to a service or talking to someone else will be more likely if you've helped to make that happen or reinforce that. There's so many things that you can do in terms of that kind of making safeguarding personal, that you were hearing about, obviously, and work in day to day. There's so much that you can do. So I really appreciate you coming to this workshop, and please be in touch with me or others at Standing Together if you'd like to hear more, and feel free to use these PowerPoint slides when they send them out, which they will do, I've been told. So thanks very much. Have a good afternoon. Thanks for your time.